This week on Dig Me Out. With your hosts, Jason Ziak and Tim Minichi.
Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. And speaking of the union, Jay, hoist the flag. We've got a union member here. Hoist the Union Jack. We need a Dig Me Out flag for people to buy.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I want to stick it. I got a nice Ford F-150. I'm going to stick it right on the back, drive it around town.
Burning coal.
I'm gonna burn some coal. Jeff Gentis is joining us. He was here last year. Any coal burned in that time period between the last visit, or you driving an EV?
No EVs for me. I'm coming in hot though, guys. I'm ready to talk music. I'm ready to talk Le Tigre. I am ready to go. I watched the documentary.
Excellent.
Let's get ready.
So last year you were here for Brian Jonestown. This one is Le Tigre, or Le Tigre, if you're dumb like me and you don't really know how to pronounce it.
4 years of high school French.
Let it agree. So I was familiar with this record, Jay. Le Tigre's debut 1999 self-titled album. I knew this from when it came out, actually, even though I was not a big Bikini Kill fan. I don't know how this came across my radar, but it did. Had you ever heard this record before?
Never heard it. I mean, I knew it was Kathleen Hanna's other band. I remember the album cover, and I had a general idea of maybe what it sounded like, but I hadn't spent any time with it.
So this came out, like I mentioned, in 1999, October, on Mr. Lady Records. Did you get this when this came out, Jeff? Or did you get it later?
No, I heard about it through the CD trading site Lala.com. That was a thing in the mid 2000s. Yeah. They had a pretty solid message board, and somehow I heard about it through there. You know, I had heard by Bikini Kill from like the Kill Rock Stars compilation, and I was like aware of them because I read Rolling Stone, but you know, they didn't have sort of radio MTV hits, and I just never had dialed into them. So I don't know what actually it was the trigger, but I know I heard about them through that site.
A little bit of detail about this. This record was produced by Chris Stamey of the DBs. He's also worked with a number of other people, like he actually worked with Alex Chilton and played with him, and produced a lot of other bands. So this was originally Kathleen Hanna, who had formerly been in Riot Girl band Bikini Kill, along with Joanna Fateman and Sadie Benning. Hannah lived with Fateman. They were doing a band called Troublemakers, and they had collaborated with Benning on a video for the 1997 album Julie Ruin, which is a solo album by Kathleen Hanna. So they wanted to do some music for, or they wanted to do some stuff for Julie Ruin, and ended up becoming this. Becoming the three of them working and became Le Tigre. Which one is it?
Tigre.
They stuck to a plan of only using like very primitive instruments, old instruments, because they wanted a different aesthetic of being in a punk band. Instead of a thrashing drum kit and, you know, bass and guitar, they wanted keyboards, a Farfisa, a drum loop. So there's no samples on this record. Everything they did, they recorded, but some of the stuff that they would do is like basically early Pro Tools. They would cut things up and piece together loops. So some of the things like sound like they're loops off of, you know, 1960s girl group albums, but they're actually them playing and then editing it. Benning was unable to tour in support of the album, and they were replaced by J.D. Sampson. And this was originally released on Mr. Lady Records, and I think it was re-released later. If you're on Spotify, it says Ouija Records. I think did some re-releases for this. Let's get into the comments over at Patreon. What did people have to say? We'll share the results of the poll later, but this is what some folks had to say about this record. Brad Duncan said, "This is an incredible worthy album. This hit like a bomb when it came out. They pretty much brought dancing back to the punk indie world in a couple years before the electroclash indie dance waves of the early 2000s. And perhaps more importantly, they were a very political band, but were fun and bouncy at the same time. The song Hot Topic is literally a history lesson in feminist trailblazers, but in the form of a catchy earworm. Not many bands can teach you feminist history while making you dance. Honestly, this is one of the most influential albums you have reviewed in some time. A genuine classic. No hyperbole. I almost said hyperboil." Ian McIver said, "Well, not a ballad album. I'm sure more time and a deeper dive may revise my rating, but for now it's a better EP." Hale Phillips said, "I think of this album as having a few tracks I love and then a bunch I don't remember as well. But every time I listen to it, one of those tracks gets a permanent promotion. This is a worthy album that I've engaged with more like it'd be a better EP, but if anyone here is worthy, it isn't me." And Willie Dillon said, "You're worthy to me, Hale." I like the positivity in our comment section, boosting each other up.
Love it.
Love it. Willie also said, "Some of it's interesting, but one of their voices reminds me of a screaming banshee, which I don't find to be terribly pleasant." Okay. Bill Davidson said, "The Tigre is fine. Not a band I would listen to other than for this DMO review. Smarty Pants 90 bands like this remind me of phonies who fake laugh at Wes Anderson movies because they want to seem cultured." Was that negative? Sorry. Decent single. Friendship Station has a cool sounding sample. As we mentioned, Bill, it's not a sample. They actually played it and sampled themselves. So I guess it's a sample technically.
It's like a meta sample.
It's a meta. Sample squared. Patrick Testa, "Within the scope of the history of alternative and rock music itself, this record sounds like a classic. So many reference points are jammed into 43 minutes. Lyrically and musically, it harkens back to 60s girl groups and 80s intelligent experimental punk and alternative. A minor quip would be the lack of real drums, but the program percussion suits this album perfectly well." We'll share the results of the poll at the end of the show. But Jay, tell me one thing you liked about the self-titled album by Le Tigre.
I'm a sucker for albums that put you in a place. You know, when you hear them, you can close your eyes and kind of imagine you're somewhere specific with a certain atmosphere, things going on, certain people there. This feels like I'm in a bedroom or I'm hearing them in a bedroom, like creatively just riffing, having conversations, working out ideas, and fairly quickly with a very simple, honest approach, just capturing those moments, which I really like. I enjoy records that put me somewhere, and this definitely puts you somewhere. I think between the lyrics at times even sound like conversations that people would have. You can imagine members of the band talking about John Cassavetes and like, hey, let's like basically turn that into a song, or the my Metro card, even Hot Topic. Just that feels like it was generated out of a conversation between two or three people and spontaneously put together into a song. And I think there's something to be said for that. It just feels pure and honest to me. And then the production complements that. So it's not just the kind of lyrical approach and the same, but also the way it's assembled. Like you mentioned, it's I guess lo-fi in that it's not overly, it's not high fidelity. It's not like a big drum kit and lots of reverb. It's like a smaller sound, drum machines. It feels assembled with, loops, and a lot of the dynamics are, things coming in and out. So it feels very much like a recording project, like a 4-track bedroom, 4 or 8-track recording project. Even the tones, they don't sound roomy. If there's bass or guitar in here, it sounds like you just plugged it straight into the 4-track and maybe had a pedal in front of it. So it just has this really like warm, um, small room sound. So it very much plays up to me in my own mind, that idea of like, oh, it's like a cozy bedroom, and people are like in a safe place putting together fun ideas spontaneously and not overthinking it. And I think that comes across in the way that the album sounds too. I think the last thing is, all that's great if there's not some fun hooks, which this, I think, album has some spots in it that are a little unexpected. I didn't expect like the 60s kind of doo-wop girl group vibes. Like, not that it's like a blatant reference, but they hit in that space somehow, either through like some of the vocal stuff, maybe in like Hot Topic, to some of the 60s feel loop treatments they did on My Metro Card is a good example. Lesson Ray is another good example. So there's some fun moments in unexpected sounds as well. And I like the comment. I agree with it can be a little bit political, a little bit like, progressive, but still fun. And I just love that they can do that. That's hard to do. And a lot of bands can pull that off. Most bands that do that, they end up sounding angry and like it turns people off. And they're able to do it in a way that's like, it just feels matter of fact and in a way that's approachable, which I appreciate as well. So a lot of good pieces and parts here that I think are pretty fun. What do you think, Tim?
Well, as I mentioned, I got this record around the time it came out. I got it on CD, and I don't know what it was that drew me to it, but I know that like having listened to, Stereolab and the Grand Royal bands like Chibomato and Biz and sort of that kind of stuff, Luscious Jackson, that kind of primed me for this, even though I had no knowledge of Kathleen Hanna's history with Bikini Kill. This probably got written up in either like the NME. I could see the NME really digging this, or some other place where, I'm reading about this indie pop, band that's danceable, but then is also political. And I'm like, oh, well, this is perfect. Like, this sounds really cool. Might have even heard it at like a listening station at the Virgin Megastore when they had those. But going back to this, I mean, my Metro Card, Deceptacon, Hot Topic, like those hooks are just ingrained in my brain. This was also around the time, I think the next year is when Brassy releases their album. And it's got a similar vibe to this. Some of it sounds like cheerleader chants, but like to an electro pop band, which it's really weird because it's such a great combo. I think one of the things I really love about this is how they are able to twist like a little bit of really underground new wave, not the real poppy stuff, but the stuff that's more driven, like more influenced by Wire, You know what I mean? Like that small drum kit. I think it's the track. Let me check my notes. It's track 6, Eau D'Bedroom Dancing. Like that could be a Wire song. I mean, he doesn't sing like that, but the minimal drum kit with just a little bit of guitar. The vocals are actually, I think, in terms of guitar, that's not the best guitar tone on this record.
No.
But the vocals are really good on that song.
I agree.
And there was stuff like that where, yes, there's the 60s influence of like, it's a very odd, when you think about what they're referencing, sort of like this bachelor pad swinging, you know, boom, 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 like that kind of stuff. The stuff that like you would hear in like an Ocean's movie now. And to hear them taking that rhythm and reappropriating it for a lot of songs which deal with feminism and are the opposite of that like mindset is such an interesting juxtaposition. So yeah, I've always dug this record. I'm glad we got to it because it's such an interesting, weird way to end the decade, especially with Kathleen Hanna having been in, you know, the guitar end of the beginning of the 90s and ending up on the, you know, keyboard drum loop end of the 90s is an interesting evolution of her sound. So, Jeff, what works for you on this record?
I mean, the first 10 seconds when I heard Deceptacon, after I picked up the album based on that recommendation through Allah, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be awesome. And I still think one of my, I don't know, top 100 songs. And it's interesting that you have a song with that level of, you know, that album, for me, the climax being so early and what it does for the rest of the album and how it sets the tone. But this album has just so many hooks. And if it doesn't have a hook, it's got a good groove. And, you know, even the lyrics for me are still just about melody hooks. I mean, the Cassavetes is a great example of just where they're just saying, you know, they're having a conversation about Cassavetes. I know some stuff about film. I have no idea what's going on in it. I didn't care because it's just a great little ditty and it is an earworm.
What's your take on Cassavetes? 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 Misogynist, genius, misogynist, genius, misogynist, genius, misogynist, genius. What's your take on Cassavetes? 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 Alcoholic, Messiah, alcoholic, Messiah, alcoholic, Messiah, alcoholic, Messiah. What's your take on Cassavetes? 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 Genius, misogynist.
Yeah, I think it's got, you know, for me, it sounds more like bands that followed things like you know, I mean, I think LCD Sound System is, there's something going on there in terms of like, you know, the dance indie world, but it's more like, if you're familiar with data rock, I mean, granted that guy has a warm baritone and it's a little bit more obvious with, you know, when he's singing about songs like Computer Camp Love, that there's humor involved, but there's still plenty of just silliness and humor in this. And I think it's sort of like the politics are there if you want them, but you certainly don't need to be focused on it or even be a, you know, lyrics person or whatever it is that you like. This is just fun for me. And, you know, and I wasn't a huge Bikini Kill person. I mean, Rebel Girl is great. Then they have some other decent tracks, but it's pretty raw punk stuff. And this here, I mean, it's interesting. The band defines itself as like electro punk. And I think it's a little bit in their approach that might be more punk than the sound itself. But I mean, I guess what I'm saying is this is just fun. You can love it. You don't have to take on any of the weight of Bikini Kill or what Kathleen Hanna means in the world of music to like this album.
Yeah, and I didn't really think about it until you brought it up, but I hear a lot of this sound in the 2000s bands. I mean, in terms of the return of like danceable music, definitely, because then you have like the Rapture and Chick 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 from New York City, and these like they're doing the danceable end of like Gang of Four,
Yeah,
and also stuff like this. And also like this reminded me of the Go Team. I don't know if you guys remember that band.
oh yeah,
I don't know if they're still around, but when that first album came out, like there was this movement in the 2000s to add like the kitschy Farfisa stuff, like, and you would get these like strange, like it wasn't the post-punk stuff that was coming. It was a lot of like, you know, Interpol and whom I think Block Party and like, you know, taking after Gang of Four and Wire and whatnot. It was like more danceable.
yeah, and their shows are, you know, they've reunited a couple times since, but they're dance parties. And that's the point. They do choreographed dancing, but they're also like just clearly, I'm having fun, goofing around dancing. They do coordinated outfits. It is, you know, it's not a poetry slam, put it that way. They're messing around and having fun. I mean, it's a good times album, and it's one of those things where you can have it. You know, it's kind of hard to have in the background because every few tracks there's just like some really, for me, sick hook that you got that's hard to ignore.
And I from what I read in the Wikipedia and then Googling a little bit, is that this was making danceable indie music was very much on Kathleen Hanna's mind, because she said, you know, the Riot Girl, you know, girl power ethos that started the 90s with Bikini Kill and these Riot Girl bands sort of morphed into the Spice Girls and girl power. And she was like, well, crap. Like, if dance music and pop music is what's going to be like the girl power, then let's make some indie girl power that's danceable.
And and I think there's a contrast there between like, they were not, I mean, we know from the song Rockstar, the whole that Courtney Love and her were not on the same plane, right? And that there were bands like L7, and they went off into, you know, L7 always had that foot in metal, whole started moving towards the sheeny, you know, even with some like, you know, touches of Fleetwood Mac before Super Cool. And I'm not just talking about the Gold Dust Woman cover. They were off on this different path. And yeah, I did feel, you know, I think it's totally right. Kathleen Hanna felt like, well, what I was doing, it's turned into, you know, was half step below a marketing campaign. And so why not just do something totally different? Which, you know, a lot of times you see that with artists where their next band, you're like, okay, Glenn Danzig, this is a huge step away from what you were doing before, where there's just not that much different. And maybe they added some other people to support kind of the stuff they were always doing. But here, this just felt like a new project. And the only thing she kept her personality, but is expressing it in a different way that, you know, again, you don't have to be on board with it. I mean, this is somebody who's married to Ad Rock. So, you know, how seriously could she take herself?
Good point. Yeah. Whenever I see either of them in a documentary, the other one is sort of like lurking behind. Like they must shoot all their documentaries together, all the appearances together, because they're always in the same documentary, even if it's not about one of them.
Yeah.
Jay, is there anything else that works for you?
I think we hit it all. I mean, they do some genre jumping too, which is fun. You know, I think we mentioned like some of the vintage sounds. There's some 80s sounds on here. I think a song like Phanta, which might be my favorite song on the record, those verses are very Devo, but then it goes to a chorus that's not. You know, it's much more melodic, ascending, cool organ part under it. there's parts of this record that almost sound like Portishead. You know, there's quite a bit of like
Mm-hmm.
shifting around, and you know, one moment I'm hearing like Go-Go's type, early Go-Go's vibes in the vocals, and other parts I'm like, oh, it's kind of like a Portishead song. You know, so it's making, I mean, despite like I guess the constraints they put on themselves to use smaller instruments, not go for the big guitars, you know, try to keep it a little bit more, you know, I guess simple from that standpoint. I think it helped create some new sounds, which I think was part of the point, right? Let's not just pick up guitars and drums. Let's try some other things and see what happens. And I think they were pretty successful, and probably stumbling on some other tones and sounds on this record that wouldn't have been possible. They would have stuck to the standard format for sure.
Now, in terms of what doesn't work, I felt like there was a couple spots where, like I mentioned with I think it's the Wire sounding song Eau D'Bedroom Dancing, like that guitar just gets so brittle in parts. Not when it's just like a single note, but there's a couple times where it's like a full chord. I'm like, oof, I wish you just dial it down in the mix a bit. Not like, I understand that we're going lo-fi, but just it doesn't be so high in the mix. Like, bury it in the mix a little bit. Put it behind the drums. There's just stuff like that. Where,
yeah. I'm also super sensitive to repetition. As soon as I hear the loop, then I can't not hear the loop, and then I get obsessed with like my brain can't get off of listening to the loop. And this album has a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to like the tracks that have at least two parts, but some of them are just one part, and then they just layer things on and take things out. Or they're just tracks like towards the later in the record, like Friendship Station and Slideshow at Free University and Dude, You're So Crazy. Those are more track oriented, like they're less songy in terms of being sharper and fun. And I just hear those loops and they just annoy me. Like once I identify them, I can only take like a couple minutes of it, and I'm like, okay, we got to wrap this up because like I'm going a little crazy listening to this loop. So that's a personal thing that I don't love, but I picked up on that sonically, and I'm with you on some of the tones. They go from like being fun and charming to like, that's a little loud or a little too off. Can we just pull it back just a little bit or do another take? Especially on that guitar part. It's like maybe just one more take.
I think it's a lot of a mix issue because there are, and also I think you're right about tempo makes a big difference. Like if it's an up tempo song, and there's a consistent, really interesting melody and vocal, then I tend to overlook how repetitive something is or how maybe the tone isn't great. But when it's stripped down to a slow tempo and all you have is a tiny little pitter patter drum loop and then this really abrasive guitar, then you notice, and then it like is like that's a lot in my ear. Jeff, is there anything that doesn't work for you?
Yeah, I guess I would. Dude, You're So Crazy for me is a groove that just doesn't get going. So I tend to skip that. The fourth track, the empty, that's two thes. I think it doesn't, it's a little too abrasive. It might be the most Bikini Kill sounding song on the record for me. I skipped that one. I don't love the video for Deceptacon. It's animated and it dulls its energy of the song for me. I think you gotta go live, live performance of that. And then I can also, when I've played tracks for others off this, Kathleen Hanna does most of the singing on the album. She has a pitch, and if you're not, I can imagine, I get it if that's not, you can't get into it. I mean, I don't like screamo. I like emo, but I don't like screamo. I just can't do like certain vocal tics. You just can't. Everyone can't handle. I can imagine people saying that about the lyrics here, or the vocals here, rather, that even especially in the chorus, not in the choruses, but in the verses, if you just can't handle a certain her higher end pitch. I get it.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a couple spots, but I get what she's doing. Like, I get her approach. So for the most part, it doesn't bother me when she gets really up there and her voice breaks and stuff like that. I get more bored. Like, what's your take on Cassavetes is fine. It's just very repetitive. And
they just beat that hook in your brain, man.
Yes.
When I was doing my notes, I was like, you know what? I'm not super into that. I like the idea of this song, and I like the lyrics. Are a lot of fun, but I'm like, this is kind of annoying. But damn it, I walked away and was like making dinner, and I was singing the song in my head. I was like, because it's just like bashed into your brain. It's just like, you will remember this
for the rest of my life. If I ever hear the name Cassavetes, that's what's going to hear. That's what I'm going to hear. What's your take on Cassavetes?
What's your take on Cassavetes?
I'll probably even do that, like, when I'm, having dementia when I'm 90. I'll be just like, what's your take on Cassavetes? And they'll be like, oh, he's a film fan, that one. And here, I didn't know if they were talking. Not that huge of a film fan. I mean, I like movies, but I didn't know. I was like, are you talking about Nick Cassavetes or John Cassavetes? I didn't actually know. Because I think Nick was like an actor in the 90s. Maybe. Or 80s. I don't know. They're just names. So I don't know. I don't have any chart info on this. I'm imagining. I mean, 1999. This was released on a tiny record label out of San Francisco. So I don't think this probably charted. Let's get to our ratings on this record, and we'll share the Patreon poll in just a moment. But Jay, where do you land after all this discussion on the self-titled album by Tigre? Where do you land?
I land at a worthy album. I mean, it's only 34 minutes or something?
Yes.
There's a stretch, like I said, between my Metro card and Less Than Ray that I don't love. It starts to lose me. I wouldn't mind if those were dropped. There's some cool sounds, and I think that's what's convincing me to go with an album over EP, because I'd be dropping three tracks. But I think it adds to that overall aesthetic of the record. This spontaneous lo-fi, do it yourself, let's just get a bunch of instruments from the pawn shop and put together a record vibe. I think it adds to that and kind of holds it together a bit as a record, even though they're not stellar tracks and as strong as something like Hot Topic or Phanta to me. So I'm with the worthy album. I think it's worth, if nothing else, to check out and spend a little bit of time with what you guys talked about in terms of how much this influenced even into the early 2000s and the term that, indie rock took towards being a little bit more danceable.
So I'm at a worthy album, but it's interesting because I think I'm leaning more towards the back end of this record. I like Friendship Station and Slideshow at Free University. If I was going to cut anything, it would be Eau D'Bedroom Dancing and Dude, You're So Crazy. I'd cut it down to 10. But like you said, this is like, it's such a short record. Everything goes by so fast.
Yeah.
There's not a song close to 4 minutes. Like 3:44, I think, is the longest song.
And the abrasive moments are fleeting.
Yes.
You might not like her voice in one part of a song, but she changes it up enough throughout the record that, you can stick with it.
Yep. Jeff?
I'm at a worthy album, fellas. I really, besides the two songs I mentioned before, love it. I have a version with a couple of BBC tracks on it too, on CD that are fun to add. I guess, and just in terms of the sales job for folks who haven't, who aren't already sold by the interludes that will be woven in here. I get for, I know some of the listeners were like, maybe in high school or college when the Riot Girl scene was a thing, and, maybe it didn't hit them the right way. And I get it, it took me a long time to get over the fact that I'd spent $18 on Vitalogy and it had a song like Bugs on it. And, that hurt me at the time because
I got like, bugs in my room.
I think I had to work about 5 hours in order to afford that CD.
How many hours do you have to work for that song?
I know. There's a lot of time, changing hot dog water.
I stood in line at a midnight sale for that.
Yeah.
And I got it on cassette.
Wow.
Yeesh.
That was a good, and, my dad still has an issue with Pink Floyd because, back when Pink Floyd was big, he just knew the guys who were Pink Floyd fans and he just wasn't into them. And I get it. And you don't want to spell women with a Y. I get it. That's cool. I'm just saying, put all that aside. Just take the fresh look at this. This is fun. Give it a shot. And like I said, half hour.
Yes. Well, the results from the poll are a bit more divided. Our patrons voted 46% worthy album, 38% better EP, and 15% decent single. This is like the 92 election, Jay. We got, when Clinton won, but it was a plurality, not a
Are you
majority.
making a Ross Perot reference?
Yeah. So decent singles like our Ross Perot.
Did you pull them on? Did you pull them on their feelings about Cassavetes though?
38% said genius. 62% said misogynist and alcoholic.
Alcoholic came in third.
Yeah. With 0.01. Well, this was a really cool record. I'm glad we got to talk about this because it's such an interesting end to the 90s with this album. So thank you, Jeff, for bringing this to us.
And this was just in a poll, right? Last month?
Yeah.
Yes.
You saved it.
I suggested it to see if, it could survive a poll or if I'd have to do it myself. It made it to the second round, came in 5th out of 6. So I pulled it out, and I got plans for another one that was a poll loser for 2023. Look out.
That's right. Even though our polls might be brutal in their elimination of very worthy records, they can always be fished out from the from their corpses can be reanimated, and we can
part of the oligarchs here, the Dig Me Out Union.
Yes. We have the technology.
Wield your power and influence.
So as mentioned, you can join us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. That's where you can vote on these polls that we do every month. It's 27 albums going up against each other, 3 rounds, and then a final round of 6, 2 from each poll. Who will the records be that we check out? We don't know until the poll is answered. It's also where you can vote in the polls for album suggestions and picks by our patrons, and where you can read the box newsletter, which is available via our website, digmeoutpodcast.com. It's a newsletter that comes out every weekend with a calendar of new releases, plus reviews of 2 new albums, books, TV shows, movies, documentaries about 80s and 90s music. It's also Dig Me Out Podcast, where you go to digmeoutpodcast.com is where you go to suggest an album by going to our album suggestion page. And lastly, Apple Podcasts is where you go to leave some positive feedback about this podcast. For Jay, I'm Tim. We're out. We'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.